and actually living saints, a lot of them. So I take my hat off now, in retrospect, to the the visionary universalism that they represent. And I think that what will happen in the second referendum in Scotland is that the Let's Leave the UK, which is itself now leaving the European Union, the Scots are going to vote to remain in the European Union and to leave the United Kingdom. All kinds of arguments will be thrown at them, like you'll be worse off economically, blah, blah, blah. I think the Scots are very intelligent people. They realise actually that's probably not the case. If you were given the choice of aligning with some of the richest countries in the world, like Germany and France and so on, and Sweden and Scandinavia and the other nations of Europe, in a free trade bloc, in which your children and so on can study in each other's countries, you can visit and work in each other's countries and live there, versus staying with the English, who are going to continue running and dominating UK politics for the next foreseeable couple of centuries, and you were an intelligent Scotsman, I think you'd vote to stick with the European element. And I think that's what's going to happen. I mean, I can predict it. I think the result will be, again, about, I think at least 80%, will vote to come out of the UK and stay with the European Union. And of course, the English press, the media based in Westminster, the BBC, the Murdoch press, all the kind of the scaremongering press will do all they can to prevent it. And you'll read all kinds of accusations and attacks against the Scots. But I think they've got very thick skin, and I think they will win that referendum. So that means that our UK, which we can now only call the United Kingdom, we've lost Northern Ireland, actually we can't even call it United Kingdom anymore because it's lost Scotland. So actually this thing that's now going to leave the European Union is called England and Wales. It doesn't sound that impressive, to be honest. I mean, what's happening here is the unravelling of the spiritual work that went into bringing this Isle of Saints into a kind of unity. I personally think, I mean, having lived in Wales for 10 years, I think as this happens, and I'm talking over the next 5 years or whatever, possibly over the next 1 or 2 years even, it might be very quick, this sequence of events, the Welsh are also going to have a rethink. And they're going to say, looks like the other Celtic nations are all staying with Europe. Do we really want to stick with these English and just kind of drift off alone into some like post-whatever state we're going to be in, post-Europe state? I think the Welsh will rethink, and I think there'll be a political realignment in Wales. And I think Plaid Cymru, which is pro-European, and progressive elements of the Labour and Liberal parties in Wales will work out a coalition deal, and I think they will eventually agitate for Wales to have a referendum on its own, which I think they will also gain independence from England. Many intelligent Welsh people have been campaigning for Welsh independence from England for centuries, ever since Llewellyn the Great and the others. And I think that this will happen. And then we're left with just England, actually, bless it, trying to go it alone. And my own prediction is at this point the English themselves will wake up and say that this isn't worth it. What did we vote for, this Brexit? We didn't mean the breakup of the United Kingdom. That's not worth it. And I think there'll be some rethinking and realigning in English politics at this point. Okay, that's a scenario that I'm saying as a political scientist and as a philosopher of history actually will come to pass. I'm prepared to put money on that. If this Brexit result is presented as it's being done through the BBC and the media, and I think the British establishment has utterly failed to comprehend what's at stake in this. They're acting as if it's fine, They're acting like the captain on the Titanic saying, yes, full steam ahead. Yeah, icebergs ahead, full steam. It's willful ignorance. Willful ignorance. And the people that are pushing Brexit are actually, in my opinion, legally accountable for treason. Because what they're doing is literally undertaking policies that will lead deliberately and willfully to the breakup of the United Kingdom. Okay, so what's the alternative? A lot of my good friends in England voted, I think, without thinking through, because they hadn't had the advantages I've had of living in Wales, of living in Scotland, of seeing the entire UK, of living in Europe, and of visiting Ireland, of studying history for years and years and years. They haven't got that hindsight and that benefit. So a lot of people voted for Brexit because it's a sort of romantic thing to do. I totally understand why they did it. We're sick of our bananas being measured wrongly. I mean, I'll give you an example of the European Union's silliness, right? So I was once travelling in Scotland, and I had to go on a long journey into the middle of Scotland, about a 50-mile journey. And that's fine, I was going up distances expected in Scotland. Could I come back the same route? No, the man in the garage warned me. He said, no, you'd have to take a detour of another 100 miles going round the other way, because the road was shut at 10 o'clock. Why was it shut? Well, because the light system under European Union regulation meant that they had to close it at a certain time, which meant a detour of 100 miles. So it's that sort of inflexibility of interpreting rules that was set in some office in Brussels that then has a knock-on effect on the quality of life in the regions of Europe. That, I think, is why a lot of British people, English people particularly, voted against it. Which is why, the Brussels bureaucrats really have to change their way of thinking and their way of doing things. And so this talk is addressed to that challenge as well. Now, what's going to happen if England has to go it alone? As I say, I don't think it will. I think there'll be a realignment in political terms. It's as if we'll have to reinvent the United Kingdom within a bigger European framework. I don't think that's a bad thing. I hope that we don't have to break up the country and watch it like a slow train crash happen before our eyes in order to then wake up at the last minute and pinch ourselves. We've been having a bad dream and we stop just this side of the precipice. I'm hoping that by sharing these thoughts, by sharing these insights from metaphysics, that people will wake up. But we're dealing with a strange phenomena in our time, which I've coined a phrase called Sophiophobia. I've written a book about it. People are afraid of sometimes learning too much if it seems like bad news. There's a feeling in England now that, yes, we know the consequences of Brexit are terrible. Yes, the pound has crashed through the floor. Yes, prices are going up. Yes, shops are shutting. Yes, businesses are leaving England. Yes, banks are relocating. Yes, it's going to get worse and worse and worse. Yes, the governor of the Bank of England has predicted, huge negative impact on the English economy, British economy, sorry. He's Canadian, so he can jump ship. And yet, the press still say, carry on regardless. I mean, how many icebergs do we have to bang into before the crew on the ship say, hang on, that captain's crazy? So there's a mood. You see, the British are very stoical. The English are very stoical. And up against adversity, they stiff upper lip kicks in and they just go ahead and do it. So the worst thing to get an Englishman to change his mind is to tell him to, and to point out that he's wrong. Because that just, puts his back up and he does the complete opposite. That's that spirit that defended Rorke's Drift and, charged at the Battle of the Somme and that heroic English kind of thin red line thing. Unfortunately, however, it needs to be, I love that spirit and I have it myself. It was that won Agincourt, blah, blah, blah. But it has to be governed by wisdom. It has to listen to common sense and reason, or it self-destructs. And it ends as a kind of a stoical, slow suicide. And I notice with alarm that England, and Britain as a whole, has got the highest incidence of self-harming among adolescents in the whole of Europe. I used to be an active secondary school teacher. I'm still a teacher, but I'm not actively, working in schools. But when I was shocked at the level of self-harm that goes on. And the statistics are scary. Kids sense, like the canary in the mine, that something's not right. So what do? They self-harm, because that's what collectively as a society we're doing. As a doctor, as a therapist, as a philosopher, if I'm trying to stop people self-harming, probably the wrong way is to go up to them and threaten them and say, stop self-harming, because it's got deep psychological causes. And you could talk about karma. You could say that Britain has to fall apart because of what it's done in the world, with its empire and its cruelty to people, its occupying of countries around the world. Maybe it's time for Britain to fall apart so that we can all watch that karmic history lesson unfold before us. I don't want to interfere with karma that is divinely ordained. If it is divinely ordained that the UK has to break up, so that future generations will look back on this whole 300-year cycle and say, empire's not the way to go, because after all, King James was not very nice to the indigenous Irish when he settled Ulster. And there's blood on the hands of the state of the UK, so maybe it has to break up. On the other hand, whilst I don't have the right to interfere with divinely ordained karma, I do have a duty to teach, as a philosopher of ethics, just as Aristotle did to Alexander the Great, or any philosopher worth their salt will give advice to statesmen. And I will look at the happiness quotient. I have to look at this from an ethical calculus, and I'll say, I think it would cause great misery and great suffering to the people of the United Kingdom if this scenario I just sketched out happens. I think that the quality of life, fear, just imagine what I've been talking about, that Scotland becomes an entirely separate country politically and legally. Ireland becomes a united country. That's probably one of the few happy stories here. But it would cause tremendous turbulence among people in the UK. Where would they live? I lived in Scotland for 7 years and Wales for 10 years. If I went back to the UK, where would I choose to live? So I think the happiness would be upset, and not even taking into account the economic diminution. The economy of the successor kingdoms or domains of England, Scotland, Wales and Ireland would be less. The economy of the UK, which has been a very successful economy in global terms, would shrink. It's already happening. It would get much worse. Now, some voices would say, this chap's an alarmist, don't listen to him. He's painting a ridiculous picture. I'm afraid, my dear friends, I'm speaking as an absolute cold realist in political science terms. I've been and lived and met and worked in these countries, and this is what legally will happen and unfold. The only way it could not happen is if the English literally militarily try to reoccupy Scotland. The Scots feel that strongly about their independence. They will insist on a second referendum and they will win it. I don't think the English are prepared to reoccupy Scotland militarily. I can't see it happening. The same in Northern Ireland. Yes, some die-hard Protestant unionists would take to the streets, would fight, probably. The British army could be re-invoked and there would be fighting again on the streets of Belfast. Again, I don't think that's going to happen. I think that there will be a referendum, and if the agreement was in favour, then I think reunification of the island would happen. I don't think I'm being a realist. I'm calling an alarm bell. I've seen the canaries in the mine, and they are dying. Okay. I just want to go back, just to finish this. It's addressed mostly to people in Britain, but I'm a Canadian citizen, I'm a Commonwealth citizen, I'm a citizen of the world, I've travelled in 33 countries. If the UK were to break up, I think it would be a catastrophe on the global level, because although it's a small country, most people I've met have great affection for the UK. When I've travelled in India, I know the British didn't get everything right in India and we did some terrible things, but I've met some amazing Indians who love British culture. They look back on the British time as a time of great affection. They can quote Shakespeare much more than the average English person, actually. And so, you know, just as India is a great federation that keeps together, and it would be sad if it broke up, I think the average Indian and the average member of the Commonwealth would be really upset if the UK started to break up, as I'm predicting will happen. And so the Commonwealth itself as something built on love, ultimately, and we all heard that wonderful speech by the Archbishop of the Episcopalian Church in America at the wedding of Harry and Meghan recently about love. Ultimately, that's where I'm speaking from, that vision of the metaphysics of love is what should be guiding our statesmen and our politicians. Unfortunately, it's not. It seems to be egotism, self-interest, and a narrow definition of selfish nationalism. People like Farage and so on. These are narrow thinkers. They're small-minded nationalists who've whipped up a kind of populist xenophobia, which is contrary to the real long-term vision of the statesmen and women that built the United Kingdom. I think the true instinct of the United Kingdom people as a whole is to stay together and to stay in Europe. And the metaphysics of that is that we have to love our enemies better, you know, rather than hating our enemies and descending into a kind of nationalism. In a sense, we have to live up to the Christian spirit that these previous generations of ours bequeathed to us. And be worthy of inheriting the kingdom that we've inherited and then sustaining and retaining it. So, anyway, these are some thoughts metaphysically. The European Union, I have many things I could have said. The metaphysics of that, one of the most important philosophers in French history, a man called Kojève, who was a Hegelian, one of the great thinkers of French modern history. He was Russian initially, ended up in Paris. He gave some lectures which influenced a whole generation of French philosophers, and all the great thinkers of France, you know, were stimulated by his interpretation of Hegel. You know what? Kojève ended up working for the European Union as a bureaucrat, happy to do that, and he's actually buried in Brussels. One of the greatest philosophers of the 20th century, gave his last few years to helping the European Union come into being. Why? Because he was a true inheritor of that pan-European tradition that Hegel and Kant and the great philosophers of European culture, which Sartre and others in France inherited, that philosophy is about seeing the good take form in the state. And Plato, who's the kind of grandmaster of European philosophy, inspired ultimately Hegel's work and Kojève and so on. So their view, as mine is, would be work with the genius that is Europe. This is the continent that gave us Leonardo da Vinci, that gave us the great musicians, that gave us Beethoven, that gave us Mozart, that gave us Shakespeare, that gave us Racine, that gave us, you know, Hegel, all these amazing thinkers. Surely we as a continent can summon up that genius now to solve the problems of bureaucracy in Brussels and to let individual countries feel more self-empowered without them having to break away totally. I think it's possible. Just as Leonardo da Vinci painted, he sketched the Vitruvian Man, which is a symbol of the squaring of the circle. It shows a adult male with his arms stretched out in a circle, but then that is located in a square. And the whole sketch was designed this puzzle of squaring the circle. Well, if we can square the circle, we can surely find a way to reconstruct politics so that the individual conscience that Hegel insists on, and Kojève and other great thinkers, is actualized within the context of a social unity. That we are both individuals, but we are part of a community. And that's the challenge we have to build peace. In these talks and in this format, I will be sharing some further thoughts on that. But I wish everybody a happy solstice. And it's also worth remembering on this day of the solstice that the great cities of Europe all had a Celtic formation, many of them, particularly in the north. So most of the cities in Britain and Ireland were obviously Druidical, Celtic foundations. But so was Paris. It was a Celtic tribe that built it. so was Leiden, so was Brussels, so was Strasbourg, so was Geneva, so was Lyon, dedicated to Lou, so was Clermont-Ferrand in France, so was Poitiers, and so was Limoges. You know, these great cities and centres of culture and civilization that are now pan-European. So was Vienna, by the way. Even rivers, the name of rivers in Europe is mostly Celtic. So the Sava River that flows through the Balkans is a Celtic name. The Druids believed above all in peace. And I'm speaking as, you know, one of the archdruids of Britain and Europe. Among many other hats, I founded the European Druid Council. So as Druids, we simply use wisdom, teaching, ideas to try and get peace for the community. That's what I'm saying to the people of Britain, people of Europe, and the people of the rest of the world. Don't let the United Kingdom fall apart over this. That referendum was only advisory. It could be postponed. Even if Parliament says, okay, there was a referendum. No, there was no date by when. The whole process, in my opinion, should be slowed and stopped and reversed. And ordinary citizens need to get active because there's a whole disjunct between the parliamentarians at the elite level that are pushing this through and what ordinary common sense is saying across the UK. You know, either those MPs are going to get the message in time, they're going to listen to my talk, they're going to respond to my letters. I've written several times to Theresa May warning her of all this, and literally I get ignorance back. So let's hope people will wake up in time, and that the implications, you see, if you refuse and reject things that come from the place of the metaphysics of love, what do you get in its place? Yeah? Just think about that. You get conflict, hatred, fear, poverty. Which do you want to vote for? Which do you want to choose? Okay, I'm going to leave you with that thought. And happy solstice. You know, this is a critical time for us.